Hey everybody, welcome once again to the road to the ProcureTech Cup. We're getting up there in terms of the season, right? So we've got a really interesting show for you planned today. I'm going to give you a bit of housekeeping before we get to the actual content, but we are talking with Trust Your Supplier this week around governance models to get the best out of your supplier relationship tools or your supplier relationship module or solutions. However you're doing those processes in your organization today, we have something for you. And so right before we say hi to our friends here or greet them on the show, just want to remind you that we've been going at it all season, every Friday. I think last week was Thursday, which was the only time we've ever done that in the season. But you have all of the show replays because we covered sourcing, end-to-end procurement suites, intake and orchestration, SRM tools, specialized solutions, spend analytics, and much more over the season. And we're down to the last 4 shows before it all culminates with our April 22nd to 24th virtual conference, ProcureTech Unpacked. It's the first time we're running it. Super excited about that. So make sure you tune in the next couple of weeks. And if you're interested in actually attending the conference, we're going to be discussing how to get the most out of ProcureTech systems, giving you a framework to navigate, which is the same framework you see on the show every week, right? But to navigate the ProcureTech market, peer-led breakout sessions, so that you're meeting people in other industries or in your industry, in other companies that have these same challenges that you have and how they're dealing with them and how they're thinking about the problem. That's often valuable to folks I interact with. And so we're really trying to do an action-packed 3 half-day conference where you come in, low cost, no travel, get the value, and then get back to your day-to-day work with some actionable content. And so we're at the back end here of ticket sales. We are capping it to 60 people. So if you do want to attend that at the end of the month, next month, scan this QR code. There's a short survey just to make sure you have the right profile to get the most value out of this event. And then I will get back to you personally as soon as possible to offer you a ticket if the fit is right. And so with the housekeeping out of the way, let's look at our agenda for today. So we'll just touch base really quickly on what is an SRM solution or supplier relationship management solution, and make sure we're on even footing with our guest on the definition and how you guys perceive it as well in the context of this show. If you are watching live, by the way, there is the comments section where you can ask questions. So as we're going through the conversation, if you have a question for myself or our guest, we'll be happy to answer it live. And we'll be talking about governance considerations, right? So SRM is probably one of the most thorny categories of ProcureTech when it comes to governance. So this show will be really valuable for that reason, right? And we'll talk about that problem that predates the tech, right? Just because a supplier is owned by everybody and nobody in organizations. We'll talk about the key stakeholders you should be thinking about before and after go live when you're deploying one of these solutions. What the AI wildcard brings to the table, right? We're in this new era of AI. What does that change? And then 5 practical tips to leave you with to avoid when you're setting up these governance models for SRM solutions. So action-packed show. We'll get straight to it. Before we actually get into the definition here, though, I want to welcome my guest, Gary Storr, so CSMO at Trust Your Supplier. Thanks so much for being here, Gary.
Yeah, it's great to be here again, Joel. We're looking forward to it. And, we're about to enter spring, and so really looking forward to having this conversation today about something that's not really super technology based. So this should be cool.
No, it has a great impact, and you mentioned spring, and it's a great time to do spring cleaning in our SRM governance models, right?
That's right.
Very cool. All right, so thanks again for being here. We'll get into the discussion in just a second. What I wanted to level set with people that are watching right now before we do anything else is, what is SRM, right? And I describe it below here in our market map at Pure Procurement as, the whole life cycle of the supplier's journey with our company, from onboarding to offboarding and everything in between, whether it be classification, qualification, data management, risk management, performance management. And then there's other things such as sustainability or compliance, which we'll touch on during the show as well, but that could enter into that journey, right, or into that data management block. So it's really everything you need throughout the entire life cycle of the supplier to take good decisions in the rest of the processes that are on this map, right? And so that's how I think about it. What about you, Gary? Would you add to that definition at all?
Well, I think it's an evolving species these days, right? Because as we've learned, looking at world events, there's many impacts that are coming in externally, right? In terms of the things that are happening geopolitically, things that are happening in the technology, things that are happening in the financial markets that are essentially reacting to those external factors. So really what we've seen is, I think, much more of a dynamic landscape in the supplier and SRM space than maybe we have in the past, right? And I think that that drives things like adaptability and governance and those things that we're going to talk about today in terms of how do you manage that with all of those influences impacting your tried and true processes, procedures, and tools.
Yeah, yeah, and that's a great point, right? Because some people have told me like, oh, this map could be a cycle, right? And I think that's right, right? We're always restarting the procurement cycle, but also the onboarding cycle with new suppliers. And when you were speaking, I was visualizing just like going through that cycle like a lot more than in the past because of the context that you highlight.
The hamster wheel is spinning much faster than it used to.
Yeah, yeah, and so that's also why I'm going like, I don't think AI is going to get rid of many jobs or procurement people. We're just going to have to spin on that hamster wheel much faster than we used to, right? Right. But I think that's a good segue into who Trust Your Supplier is and why we invited you to have this conversation. So would you enlighten us on what TYS is all about?
Yeah, well, I'll give it a shot. So TYS is briefly, we're obviously a supplier relationship management solution. And this is our one of our marketing slides, obviously a little bit of a brag slide, but we really specialize in three key areas. So what we call supplier pre-screening, know before you go, looking at a supplier and the supplier's credentials, the supplier's risk areas before you engage with the supplier, right? So that's going to change. That's going to allow you to get into your change management process upstream and look at how how a supplier might fit or not fit into your landscape, right? And then obviously onboarding and lifecycle management is kind of blocking and tackling of any SRM solution. You have to be able to bring the supplier on board with all of their data and information, and then you have to manage them through that relationship that you have with them until as you go through time. And then as you go through that relationship, you want to be able to monitor them because, as we just discussed, this landscape is constantly evolving, constantly changing, right? And so you need to understand, especially from a risk perspective, how that supplier is performing, what risks those suppliers may be presenting to you as an organization, how they're aligning with things like your corporate objectives. And so we are able to bring capability to the organization that allows you to look at them in real time and understand in a snapshot, okay, what's going on. No longer do you onboard and throw the onboarding profile in the file cabinet. You can look at these suppliers every day. And of course, we have tools that will notify you. You don't have to look at 20,000 suppliers each day, right? Obviously. So that's a little bit about TYS. Obviously, we do a lot more than that. But when we talk to our customers, these are the things that are most important to them.
Yeah, and I think if I recall the last time we were on the show, we used the analogy of like the picture, which is that front end, right? But also being able to tell them, like, take constant pictures and have the movie in your solution so that you can adapt to what's happening in the plot line, so to speak, right? Which is that's great, right? So I think it shows in and of itself why I wanted to have you on the show, Gary, to talk to us about this topic, which we should get into now, given the time flies. Around how do we think about governance for SRM solutions, and it's probably even wider than that in terms of the discussion, right? Which is how do we think about suppliers as data objects and the governance around those, and then how does the tech get into that, right? So I'd love to have you launch into our discussion here.
Yeah, so these are things that we're going to speak about today, right? And I in the intro I did mention that we're not going to talk a lot about technology today. And that's because what we're really talking about here is governance and change management below the governance. They really deal with how you operate, right? And how you steward information, how you steward people, how you steward your process and your procedures, how you establish standards. Just give you a really quick example. there used to be a company called the West Indian Tea Company. You may have heard of it. At one time, it was the largest and most powerful company in the world. This is like 400 or 500 years ago. Guess what they had? They had an extremely tight governance problem. When North America was burgeoning, I guess, they were leveraging that almost better than anyone, right? The reason they were able to do that in part is because they had really strong governance. This has been kind of well chronicled if you're into history as I am. So this is not something that just came up 5 years ago, right? Governance is essential for mature organizations to have an effective way to operate their business, whether it's supplier management or anything else. And so we'll talk about that, right? And we'll talk about who the stakeholders are and how AI, will impact that as we go forward, right? So ownership is extremely important, obviously, in any governance process. And what my experience with governance is either everybody wants to own the process, which means no one does, or no one wants to own it because it's a time bomb, and so then no one owns it, right? And so we have these gaps in ownership for these various reasons. Okay, and then what that breeds is what we call accidental governance, because when a governance step has to be executed reactively, right? Somebody creates a spreadsheet, or today maybe somebody jumps into ChatGPT and makes something up, right? And so this is just, this is a floating governance model that has no direction, right? And it's not very effective for your organization because it may work for today, and it may work for your particular silo, but it's not something that's going to be cohesive across the organization and throughout the time frame, right? And so many organizations say, hey, we'll just buy a tool. Hey, how many organizations have just bought SAP? Oh, it's going to fix our problem. Well, guess what? Probably didn't, right? Because you have to tell that tool how you want to operate, right? Even if you take the tool out of the box and plug it in and turn it on, and I don't know if you guys remember the old VCRs, you still had to set the clock that was blinking 12, right? You have to do that, right? Otherwise, your governance process is blinking 12 all the time, and you never know what time it is, right? So those are some things I think that organizations really need to focus on before they really get into using technology to drive effectiveness.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, even in the era of AI, right? Because I just see AI as like, an automation tool that allows for more ambiguity than previous generations of automation tools, but you still need to give it a direction, so to speak, right? In terms of, and I think the points you touch on here illustrate that well.
Right. And having the right people involved is super important too. Your organization, any mature, multinational enterprise organization, is going to have, obviously many touch points, and herding all those cats, always the number one challenge. Anybody that's been through it understands that, right? But you have to have certain people at the table before you implement a solution, whether it's a technology solution, a process solution, even it's a simple procedure. All the stakeholders need to be involved, right? And so I just point out a few here. There's obviously many more, depending on your organization. Compliance is particularly important because guess what? They typically carry a hammer in the organization. So if you create a process and they're not at the table and they don't like it, you're going to get audited. And guess what? You're probably going to be back at that same table trying to figure out how to re-engineer that process because you didn't do it right, or you didn't do it in line with what compliance has set forth as your corporate standards.
Goals. Yeah.
Finance, obvious one. Most businesses need to collect money and pay their vendors. So if you don't have finance involved, then maybe those processes, whether they're integral or they're attached processes, could break. IT obviously is becoming more and more centerpiece here. Now, the interesting thing about technology and data is they used to be just kind of homogenized as one thing, right? They're not one thing, right? So data is extremely valuable resource in most organizations, right? And IT is just kind of the conveyor belt, right? That's moving the data around, if you want to think about it that way. And I think we have to separate the two. And data, especially in the advent of AI, more and more, it's more and more important to have that governance, because if you're going to start relying on AI to generate direction, and AI is essentially becoming a coworker in your organization. They better have the right data. It's like hiring somebody without the right educational background, the right work experience. If your AI is not properly informed, how can you rely on the result, right?
Yeah.
And then, the people that say, hey, look, in the case of SRM, I need a new supplier. Well, let's get those guys at the table, because we want to understand how those requests are processed, right? Get them there, understand before you start making decisions.
And what I see on this slide too, like one of the stakeholders that watches the show but isn't on the slide is procurement, right? And I'm curious to get your perspective on, does procurement have a natural fit to be the coordinator or the owner of the supplier data record in its entirety, even though they might not be the owners of different views, right, or different sets of subsets of data tied to that data object, tied to the supplier, right? What do you see in the clients that you work with, and what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, well, that's an outstanding point. I mean, this, what we're talking about here is from the lens of procurement, I suppose. But yes, certainly procurement is front and center. I think most organizations, procurement would be the steward of this process and the governance around that. Certainly, there are organizations where finance plays a stronger role, where IT plays a stronger role. I've never run across them, but I'm sure there's organizations where compliance or even other organizations would play a very strong role. But the bottom line here is you have to identify who's the owner, who's the steward there, and then that group or that individual needs to do the outreach to everybody else, right, that's involved. And think about it like a RACI. Everybody's done a RACI, right? Responsibility, accountability, consult and inform, right? So you have to understand everybody on that RACI, they are all stakeholders, and you have to understand how they are going to fit into this process. Otherwise, they're standing out in the snow, right? And eventually they're going to knock on the door, and you're going to be like, "Whoa, what do I got to do with this process here? Because I didn't fit this particular piece in."
Or they're going to have built a shed across the way, and you're like, "Hey, no, you got to come in here."
That's right. Yes.
But the way you were illustrating it, like I thought of like a hub and spoke model, right? Where there's all these different spokes, but I see procurement as being the natural hub to connect all those spokes. But if you don't see yourself as such as a function, and you don't claim that role, then I find like governance becomes a nightmare, right? Like you're never the other spokes in that wheel aren't naturally inclined to become the hub, so to speak, right?
That's a really good analogy. And if you think about it, the more spokes in a wheel, the stronger the wheel is, right? So if you have a wheel with two spokes, you're probably not going to go very far. So it's a great analogy. So after you go live, what many organizations do is they put this great process together, governance process together. They go through the change management. They deploy their technology, and then everybody goes back to their jobs, and nobody talks about it again, right? You need to have a steering committee. You got to make decisions, because no 2 days are alike. Things are changing. We talked about this. Things are changing constantly. You're basically in a cyclone, right? And so if you're going to stand pat in a cyclone, the storm will move you. Okay, so you have to have a steering committee there that's going to make these decisions. When the organization decides to go in a different direction, and the market changes, geopolitical landscape changes, tariffs or whatever, those kinds of things require a steering committee to at least do an assessment, if not a change, right? And then you have to have stewards over the data. We talked a few minutes ago about how data is this new natural resource that organizations are very important to organizations, right? So who's stewarding the data, right? And I got contacts and there's quick examples, but again, back to the AI, who's ensuring this data is accurate and current, and feeding the right LLMs so that these AI engines are using it properly, right? And then you have to have a cadence, right? You can't just have a governance or a steering committee and a governance committee and never meet and never talk and never have any kind of dialogue over what the roadmap looks like to maintain that process. So you got to get away from the abandonment and nurture and feed this. It's like planting a tree. you do all the preparation to plant a tree, but you got to nurture the tree, right? Otherwise, the tree's going to die. And that's what happened to many of the governance processes that organizations put in place today.
And so, Gary, that steering committee concept, like, is it like the supplier, I'll call it like the supplier data object committee, if I can term it that way, right? Where it's like, hey, how are we making the structure of how we deal with suppliers or how we capture supplier data evolve over time, given all of these various stakeholders and their changing needs?
Yeah, I think they need to be on a part of the committee, right? Like the committee, those spoke back to the wheel. That's that wheel. Every spoke in that wheel has to have a representative on the committee, right? Because those individuals and those teams and those organizations are going to, and not only will they be impacted, but they're going to inform, right? So there's an input and output, I guess. So if we're drawing this spoke, we'd see this an arrow going into the hub and an arrow going out of the hub, because we might have a finance person come in and say, hey, look, we're changing we're changing the way we do cost accounting or something, right? Well, how does that impact the data, right? Yeah. And so that's a very important thing that the steering committee needs to consider. And do they need to take action? And how are they going to architect for that change? And what is, who needs to be notified? And how do we change our standards to accommodate that? All those things need to be considered.
And that's why I asked that question, right? Because to me, it's like steering committee often has this project connotation, but the way I'm understanding it is it's a constant steering committee on the supplier data object, right? Like it's about the data object and not the project or the technology, right? It's about, to your example, right? When there's a business change, what's the impact on how we capture supplier data? Who's going to own it going forward? How do we change the policy or the standards for supplier data capture, right? And then how do we push that back out to our tooling or our data providers or what have you, right? So very interesting point. As we move on here to the next section, actually, there's a question that I wanted to bring in because it feeds right into our next slide, which is like, how do I avoid shadow procurement, especially in a rather decentralized environment, right? And so we're painting this nice picture of a hub and spoke model with all of the players at the table and a committee and all this governance model end state, right? That works really well, like a well-oiled machine, a well-oiled sausage machine, some might say. But I think how you need to think about it in a context where you may not have that maturity, you may not have everybody aligned on this concept, is to think about, okay, well, what are the different slices or the different variances or views or lenses, if you want to use different terms, right, of the supplier data object. And at the beginning, often it's just like, hey, we just need, basic qualification, like that picture that we were discussing at the beginning, and transactional data so that I can get them paid and in our ERP system, right? So I think I would start there. If you've got a shadow procurement problem, suppliers are being created all over the place, right? It's like, okay, how can we centralize just these basic things with like the least amount of stakeholders possible? And then once we've got that small sausage machine going, right, we've got a couple stakeholders, things are going well for that, then we can start expanding to compliance, to risk, to ESG, innovation, quality, et cetera, right? By bringing those stakeholders into the fold and releasing a new version or new views within that SRM process so that it remains manageable over time. And we're not trying to design everybody's requirements into the SRM process and SRM technology at the same time. So I'm wondering, Gary, like, would you add anything to that? Are you in agreement with that?
I guess you're always going to have the not invent it here mentality, but if you develop a proficient process that services the organization, then the opportunity for someone to create a shadow environment, a shadow process, is going to be diminished. Could it happen? Obviously, right? And I don't know, the bigger the organization, the more prevalent it becomes. Yeah. And I don't know that, human nature sometimes takes over. But if something works, people tend to use it, right? Like when you go to the grocery store, you use the roads that have already been established. You don't drive through the woods or over the fields or up the side of the mountain. You take the easy path to the grocery store, right? And I think, people will do that. If you have, a vendor request process that's easy to navigate, where everybody understands the process, everybody understands the standards, they're going to use that instead of just calling the vendor and sending them some contract they whipped up out of ChatGPT, right? So those are the things that mature organizations do, right? And then when they do find these cottage industries or these shadow procurement processes, they're able to kind of in a friendly manner blend them in, right? So they become part of the whole.
Yeah, and I think it's starting where it hurts the most in that chain, right? And growing the sausage machine, so to speak, in that direction, so that it does become the path of least resistance, and human nature guides people towards that path of least resistance.
Right. Yeah. So AI, we could talk for hours on AI, obviously, and I think this is changing every day, right? But we have to really understand that AI, especially agentic AI and some of the evolving AI technology, right, is surfacing insights, right? It's not the conventional, report or visualization where it's giving you just raw data or even interpretive data, right? The AI engine is giving you insights, right? And so you have to know, in what context that AI is using that, and we need to be able to figure out how are we going to turn on and off some of these AI features, right? Because some of them we may not want or may not be ready for, right? Who reviews the outcome to validate it? I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And how do we audit? Like, I don't know anyone that's auditing AI that says, how correct is it? How successful are we being with AI versus the old process? For every answer AI gives me, is it 80% correct, 100%, 20%? Is anybody tracking that? Do we know? So I think those are the kind of things that we're going to have to get into as we go forward, because ultimately, just like we have performance reviews for our employees, we're going to have the performance reviews for our AI engines, right? And really evaluate from a data perspective how they're performing.
So you're saying that AI doesn't simplify governance; it makes it more complex with more questions, which I agree with, by the way.
I think that's true. I think that's
true.
Yeah. So this is a real quick example, right? So think about, we just hired an entry-level analyst, maybe top person in their class at school, right? They just came in, they're all excited about their job. They got an AI generated risk flag. They love AI. Hey, AI must be right. I'm going to go with it, right? And that may be the right thing to do, right? Or you have the seasoned professionals, been around, knows the ropes, maybe a little skeptical of AI, maybe wants to audit everything AI does, right? And go back and use their tried and true processes and procedures and methods to validate that, to see if they get the same result. Now, both of those are reasonable approaches, but the model has to account for both, right? And because it has to understand there's going to be generational differences, there's going to be cultural differences in how these kinds of things are going to be interpreted. And as we go through time, this is going to exacerbate, right? So it's very important for us to have a governance model to ensure we have consistent decision-making with inconsistent inputs and inconsistent assessment vehicles, right? In most cases, those are human beings, right? So these are very important factors. I don't think a lot of people are thinking about, but as you go through your governance processes, especially around AI, you better start thinking about it, because this will happen.
And it's a great tee up for next week's show around change management in SRM solutions, right? And so I think there's some of this as well around how do we ensure that we're trusting AI functionality in the right use cases in our context with the data and the architecture and the systems and the processes that we have, right? And adapting that or communicating that to these various maturity stakeholders.
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple things that we see, just common things that organizations. We talked about phantom ownership, right? That's and I'll give the example here again about RACI. So you have to really, if you don't have an owner, someone will pop up, and then that might change. Multiple owners may pop up. You have to have some strong ownership and stewardship, right? The big bang, right? I've established a governance model. Now let's put all of our suppliers on April 1st. probably the wrong thing to do, right? Crawl, walk, run. Don't just, push the big red button because it's not an easy button. It's it's typically we're going to have to do it all over again button, right? Don't put the governance deck in a folder and stick it in a file cabinet, because then if you're going to do that, don't even bother starting, right? Like this is an evergreen dynamic process that has to live as part of your organization. Think about it like almost like an agentic process, right? The process is one of your coworkers, right? And you have to live with it. You have to live it. Otherwise, it's not going to provide the value and the investment that you put into it. Ignoring the suppliers, a lot of organizations say this is the way we're going to do it, or suppliers are going to comply. Well, that's not always the case. And don't you want to bring your suppliers are critical? Why don't you bring them into the fold and understand how they might make your process more effective, right? So bring your suppliers, at least have them represent it as you go through defining and cultivating and nurturing your process, your governance process. And probably, most importantly, again, like go live's where the implementation ends, but that's really where the governance starts, right? Everything else is just, PowerPoint slides, right? When you deploy a new solution, that's when governance starts, right? So they're in parallel, and they should remain in parallel as we go through time.
And I see, as you're saying these 5 things, like I'm seeing concretely, like procurement taking ownership of the hub, not just being another spoke in the wheel, and then putting cadence meetings in place with the relevant stakeholders, keeping it small at the beginning to avoid that big bang, and then iterating on it while keeping the supplier experience in check so that you grow it organically, but with a structured governance model that can also like be adjusted and develop organically as you grow the solution too. So I hope that brings all of the 5 together.
Yeah. So, like in summary, I mean, we need to document the ownership question. Ownership is just so important, right? Like somebody has to be in charge of it, right? Otherwise, we've all been in, those kinds of situations where we don't really have firm ownership. And I would bet you everybody here would tell you there was failure associated with the outcome, right? Yeah. You have to have AI over your governance. We all do it. We all use AI every day. We all do it. We're all loosey-goosey around it. But if we have a mature business critical process, we have to have governance over the AI model. It's not optional. It's essential, right? And then, version control, I think goes without saying, but you got to know, like, as you iterate this thing and it lives and breathes and matures, what model am I on? Because when I have to go back and ask a question that was on 1.0, 1.5, 2.3, you have to be able to have a point of reference, right? So make sure you're documenting your version,
your changes over time. So great stuff, Gary. I think we touched on a number of insights which I think are super valuable for people watching the show this week. And we're a bit over time here, but that's always fine to me if we're providing value to folks watching, right? So I want to say a big thank you to everybody watching. I know I have that on the left-hand side. We put out the invitations and some additional best practice content from the Pure Procurement newsletter every Sunday night Eastern time. And I think, Gary, you guys prepared something as well to leave people with if they want to learn more or engage more with Trust Your Supplier.
Yeah, we have. So if you want to take a look at this QR code here, this is going to take you to a little bit of I think it's a 2 or 3 minute demo that shows you how we're using AI in our technology to bring supplier risk to our customers. And so it may be something interesting you might want to look at. We've created basically an AI coworker to help you with your supplier management, risk management.
Oh, very cool. So people have to check that out. So if you're still on the stream watching live, thanks so much for tuning in. If you're watching the replay, these links are still active as well. And thanks to everybody for tuning in. And Gary, most of all, thank you for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Really enjoyed it. And everyone have a good weekend, and we'll talk down the road.
All right. Thanks so much. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.